The following day, Chernetsov was talking to one of his few acquaintances among the Soviet Russians, a soldier called Pavlyukov, who worked as a medical orderly in the infirmary. Pavlyukov was complaining about having to leave his present job to join the digging gangs. "It's the party members," he said. "They've got everything sewn up. They hate me because I bribed the right people and got myself a good job. But they know how to look after themselves all right. They always end up working in the kitchens, washrooms and stores. Do you remember what it was like before the war, Grandad? Well, it's the same here. They even get their men in the kitchen to give them the biggest portions of food. An old Bolshevik gets looked after as if he were in a health resort. But the rest of us are no better than dogs. They just look straight through you, even when you're starving to death. Is that fair? After all, we've had to endure Soviet power too." Chernetsov admitted it was 20 years since he had last lived in Russia. He knew that the words émigré and abroad immediately made Soviet Russians keep their distance, but Pavlyukov didn't react at all. They sat down on a pile of planks. Pavlyukov, who seemed a real son of the people with his wide nose and forehead, looked at the sentry pacing about his concrete tower and said, "I've got no choice. I'll have to join up with Vlasov, otherwise it'll be the end of me." "Is that your only reason?" asked Chernetsov. "Is it just a matter of survival?" "Well, I'm certainly not a kulak," said Pavlyukov, "and I've never had to slave away in the camps felling trees, but I've got my own grudges against the communists. No, you mustn't sow that. No, you mustn't marry her. No, that's not your job. You end up turning into a parrot. Ever since I was a child, I'd wanted to open a shop of my own, somewhere a man could buy whatever he wanted, with his own little restaurant. There, you've finished your shopping. Now treat yourself to a beer, to some vodka, to some roast meat. I'd have served country dishes. And my prices would have been really cheap. Baked potatoes, fat bacon with garlic, sauerkraut. And do you know what I've given people to go with their drinks? Marrow bones. I'd have kept them simmering away in the pot. There, you've paid for your vodka. Now have some black bread and some bone marrow. And I'd have had leather chairs, so there wouldn't be any lice. You just sit down and be quiet. We'll look after you." Well, if I'd come out with any of that, I'd have been straight off to Siberia. But I don't really see what harm it could have done anyone, and I'd only have charged half the price of the state shops. Pavlyukov cast a sidelong glance at Chernetsov. 40 men from our barracks have already signed up." "Why?" "For a bowl of soup and a warm greatcoat, and because they don't want to be worked to death." "Any other reasons?" "Some of them have ideological reasons." "What exactly?" "Oh, various ones. The people killed in the camps, the poverty in the villages. They just can't stand communism." "No," said Chernetsov, "that's not right. It's despicable." The Soviet citizen looked at the émigré with half-mocking, half-bewildered curiosity. "It's just not right," repeated Chernetsov. "It's dishonourable. This is no time to settle scores, and it's the wrong way to go about it. You're not being fair to yourself or to your country." He stood up and rubbed his buttocks. "No one can accuse me of sympathy for the Bolsheviks," he said, "but believe me, now's not the time to settle accounts. Don't do it. Don't join Vlasov." In his excitement, he had begun to stammer. "Listen to me, comrade," he repeated. "Don't do it." Pronouncing the word comrade took him back to the days of his youth. "Oh God," he muttered. "Oh God, could I ever?" The train drew away from the platform. The air was thick with dust and carried a variety of disparate smells: lilac, fumes from the kitchen of the station restaurant, smoke from the locomotives, the smell that comes from rubbish dumps in the spring. The lantern drew slowly further away. In the end, it was just a still point among the red and green lights. The student stood for a while on the platform and then went out through the gate beside the station. As she said goodbye, the woman had flung her arms around his neck and kissed his hair and forehead, overwhelmed like he was by a sudden surge of emotion. He walked away from the station. His head span, and a new happiness welled up inside him. It was as though something were beginning that would eventually fill his whole life. He remembered that evening when he finally left Russia. He remembered it as he lay in hospital after the operation to remove his eye. He remembered it as he walked through the cool, dark entrance to the bank where he worked. The poet, Kodasevich, who had also left Russia for Paris, had written about just this. A pilgrim walks away in the mist. It's you who comes into my mind. On a fume-filled street a car drives past. It's you who comes into my mind. I see the lamps come on at 6, but have only you in my mind. I travel west, your image picks its endless way through my mind. He wanted to go back to Mostovskoye and ask, "You didn't ever know Natasha Zadonskaya, did you? Is she still alive? And did you really walk over the same earth as her for all those decades?" Casey, a burglar from Hamburg, who wore yellow leggings and a cream-coloured check jacket with outside pockets, was in a good mood at roll call that evening. Mispronouncing the words, he sang quietly, "Kali zavtra voina, yesli zavtra..." Oh, God. There was a good-humoured expression on his yellow, wrinkled face. He clapped the other prisoners on the back with a puffy, hairless, snow-white hand, whose fingers were strong enough to strangle a horse. He didn't think twice about killing. It was no more difficult than pulling out his knife in jest. He was always rather excited after he had killed someone, like a kitten that's been playing with a Maybug. Most of the murders he committed were on the instructions of Sturmführer Drottenhaar, the director of the medical section of the Eastern Bloc. The most difficult part was carrying the corpses to the crematorium, but Casey didn't have to do this himself, and no one would have dared ask him. Nor were people allowed to get so weak they had to be taken to the place of execution on stretchers. Drottenhaar knew his job. Casey never made rude remarks or hurried the people who were to be operated on. He never pushed them or hit them. Although he'd climbed the 2 concrete steps more than 400 times, he felt a real interest in his victims. An interest aroused by the mixture of horror, impatience, submissiveness, and passionate curiosity with which they looked at their executioner. Casey could never understand why the very mundaneness of his job so appealed to him. There was nothing special about the special cell. It was just a stool, a grey stone floor, a drain, a tap, a hose pipe, and a writing desk with a notebook on it. The operation itself was equally mundane. If he had to shoot someone, Casey called it emptying a coffee bean into someone's head. If he had to give someone an injection of carbolic acid, he called it a small dose of elixir. The whole mystery of human life seemed to lie in the coffee bean or the elixir. Really, this mystery was astonishingly simple. Casey's brown eyes simply weren't those of a human being. They seemed to be made of plastic, or some yellowish-brown resin. When they took on an expression of merriment, they inspired terror. Probably the same terror a fish feels when it swims up to a snag half covered in sand and suddenly discovers that the dark mass has eyes, teeth, and tentacles. Casey was well aware of his own superiority over the artists, revolutionaries, scholars, generals, and members of religious sects in the barrack huts. It wasn't just a matter of the coffee bean or the elixir. It was an innate feeling of superiority that brought him real joy. Nor was it a matter of his huge physical strength, his ability to brush obstacles aside, to knock people off their feet, or smash through steel with his bare hands. No, what he admired in himself were the complex enigmas of his own soul. There was something very special in his anger. something in the play of his moods that transcended logic. On one occasion, a group of Russian prisoners picked out by the Gestapo was being taken to the special barracks. Casey had asked them to sing some of their favourite songs. 4 Russians with swollen hands and sepulchral expressions struck up, "Where are you now, my Suliko?" Casey listened sorrowfully, glancing now and again at the man with high cheekbones who was standing furthest away. He respectfully restrained from interrupting. But at the end of the song he told this man that since he hadn't sung with the group, he must now sing a solo. He looked at the dirty collar of his tunic and the remnants of his torn-off major's tabs, and said, "Verstehen Sie, Herr Major? Do you understand, swine?" The man nodded. Casey picked him up by the collar and gave him a little shake. He might have been shaking an alarm clock that had gone wrong. The newly arrived prisoner punched Casey on the cheekbone and cursed him. Everyone thought that would be the end of the prisoner. But instead of killing Major Yershov there and then, Casey simply led him to a place in the corner beside the window. It had been lying unoccupied, waiting for the appearance of a prisoner Casey took a liking to. Later that day, Casey brought Yershov a hard-boiled goose egg and said with a laugh, "Ihre Stimme wird schön." And from then on, Yershov remained a favourite of Casey's. The other people in the barracks also treated him with respect. His unbending severity was tempered with gentleness and gaiety. Brigade Commissar Osipov, one of the men who had sung Suliko, was furious with Yershov after the incident with Casey. "A very tricky customer indeed," he said of him. Rostovskoy, on the other hand, soon christened him the master of men's minds. Another man to dislike Yershov was Kotikov, a silent fellow who seemed to know everything about everyone. Kotikov was colourless. Everything about him, his eyes, his lips, even his voice, was colourless. The lack of colour was so pronounced that it became a colour in its own right. Casey's gaiety during roll call that evening made the prisoners tense and frightened. They were expecting something bad to happen. Day and night their anxious premonitions waxed and waned. Towards the end of roll call, 8 capos came into the special barracks. They wore ridiculous, clown-like peaked caps and a bright yellow band on their sleeves. You could tell from their faces that they didn't fill their mess tins from the general cauldron. The man in command, Koenig, was tall, fair-haired and handsome. He was dressed in a steel-coloured greatcoat with torn-off stripes. Beneath it you could glimpse a pair of brilliantly polished boots that seemed almost white. A former SS officer, he had lost his commission and been imprisoned for various criminal offences. He was now head of the camp police. "Mütze up!" he shouted. The search began. With the trained habitual movements of factory workers, the capos tapped tables for hollow spaces, shook out rags, checked the seams of people's clothes, and looked inside saucepans. Sometimes, as a joke, they kneed a prisoner in the buttocks and said, "Your good health!" Now and again they turned to Koenig with something they'd found. A note, a razor blade, a pad of paper. With a wave of his glove, Koenig let them know whether or not it was of interest. Meanwhile, the prisoners remained standing in ranks. Mostovskoy and Yershov were standing next to each other, glancing at Koenig and Casey. The faces of the 2 Germans looked as though they had been cast from metal. Mostovskoy swayed on his feet. He felt dizzy. He pointed at Casey and said, "A fine individual." "A truly splendid Aryan," replied Yershov. Not wishing to be overheard by Chernetsov, he whispered, "But some of our lads aren't much better." Keen to join in the conversation he couldn't hear, Chernov said, Every people has a sacred right to its own heroes, saints and villains. Mostovskoy turned towards Yershov, but what he said was also addressed to Chernetsov. Of course, we've got our share of scoundrels too, but still, there's something unique about a German murderer. The search came to an end, and the command was given to go to bed. The prisoners began to climb up onto the boards. Mostovskoy lay down and stretched out his legs. Then he realized that he hadn't yet checked to see if his belongings were all in place. He sat up with a wheeze and began to go through them. At first he thought he must have lost his scarf or his gingham footcloths. In the end he found them. But his feeling of anxiety remained. Yershov came over and said in an undertone, "Capo Nedzleski's been gossiping. He says our block's being split up. A few of us are being kept for further interrogation. The rest are being sent to general camps." "What does it matter?" asked Mostovskoy. Yershov sat down. "Mikhail Sidorovitch," he said in a very clear whisper. Mostovskoy raised himself up on one elbow and looked at him. "I've been thinking about something important, Mikhail Sidorovitch. I need to talk to you. If we're going to die, I think we should do it in style." Yershov went on in a whisper. As he listened, Mostovskoy grew more and more excited. It was as though some magical wind was blowing on him. "Time is precious," said Yershov. "If the Germans ever take Stalingrad, then everyone will just sink back into apathy. You only have to look at someone like Kotikov to see that." Yershov's plan was to form a military alliance with prisoners of war. He went through this plan point by point, as though he were reading from notes. The imposition of discipline and solidarity on all Soviet citizens in the camp, the expulsion of traitors, sabotage, the setting up of action committees among the Polish, French, Yugoslav and Czech prisoners. He glanced up at the dim light and said, "There are some of our own men in the munitions factory. They trust me. We can start hoarding arms. Then we can widen our horizons. 3 men's cells. An alliance with the German underground. The use of terror against traitors. Our final goal, a general uprising. A united free Europe." "A united free Europe? Oh, Yershov, Yershov. I'm not just talking, I mean business." "Well then," said Mostovskoy, "you can count on me." He shook his head and repeated, "A free Europe. Now we've even got our own section of the Communist International here in the camp, with 2 members, one of them not even a communist." "With your knowledge of English, French and German, we'll be able to make thousands of contacts," said Yershov. "What price your Comintern now? Prisoners of the world unite!" Looking at Yershov, Mostovskoy pronounced a phrase he thought he had forgotten long ago. "The will of the people." He felt quite surprised at himself. "We'll have to talk to Osipov and Colonel Zlatorets," Yershov went on. "Osipov's an important figure, but he doesn't like me. You must talk to him yourself. And I'll talk to the colonel today. That makes 4 of us." Day and night, Yershov mulled over his plans for an underground movement embracing the whole of Germany. He worked out a system of communications between the various organizations and learned the name of each different camp, together with its railway station. He'd have to devise a secret code, and the organizers would need to be able to move freely from camp to camp. He'd have to find a way of getting the clerks to include their names in the transport lists. His soul was inspired by a great vision. The work of thousands of underground agitators and heroic saboteurs would culminate in an armed takeover of the camps. The men involved in the uprising would need to capture the camp anti-aircraft guns and convert them to weapons that could be used against tanks and infantry. He'd have to pick out the prisoners who had experience of anti-aircraft guns and form them into gun crews. Major Yershov knew what camp life was like. He was aware of the power of fear, bribery, and the desire for a full stomach. He had seen how many people had exchanged honest soldiers' tunics for the epaulets and light blue overcoats of Vlasov's volunteers. He had seen apathy, betrayal, and grovelling obsequiousness. He had seen people's horror at the horrors inflicted on them. He had seen them petrified with fear before the officers of the dreaded SS. Yes, ambitious though he was no mere dreamer. During the black days of the German blitzkrieg, he had been able to rally men whose stomachs were distended with hunger. His boldness and enthusiasm had been a source of encouragement to all his comrades. He was a man whose contempt for violence was passionate and unextinguishable. Everyone could feel the bright warmth that emanated from Yershov. It was the same simple, necessary warmth that comes from a birch log in a Russian stove. It was this good-hearted warmth, not just the power of his intellect and his fearlessness, that had made him the acknowledged leader of the Soviet officers in the camp. He had long known that Mostovskoy was the first person he'd reveal his plans to. Now, more than ever before in the 33 years of his life, he had a sense of his own strength. Here he was, lying on the bedboards and gazing up at the rough planks of the ceiling. He felt as though he were looking up at the lid of a coffin, his heart still beating. His life before the war had been difficult. His father, a peasant in the Oblast of Voronezh, had been dispossessed in 1930 after being denounced as a kulak. At that time, Yershov had been doing his military service. He had refused to break with his father. He was turned down by the military academy, even though he had passed the entrance exams with the grade excellent. After graduating from military school with considerable difficulty, he was posted to a district recruiting office. Meanwhile, his father and the rest of his family had been deported to the northern Urals. Yershov applied for leave and set off to visit them. From Sverdlovsk, he travelled 200 kilometres on the narrow-gauge railway. On either side of the line were vast expanses of bog and forest, together with stacks of dressed timber, barbed wire, barrack huts, dugouts, and tall watchtowers that looked like toadstools on giant legs. The train was delayed twice. A posse of guards was searching for an escaped prisoner. During the night, they waited in a passing loop for a train coming from the opposite direction. Yershov was unable to sleep for the whistles of sentries and the barking of OGPU dogs. Close to the station was a large camp. It took Yershov over 2 days to reach the end of the line. He had a lieutenant's tabs on his collar, and his documents were in order. Nevertheless, each time they were checked, he expected to be packed off to a camp with the words, "Come on, get your things together." It was as though even the air in this region had barbed wire around it. He travelled the next 70 kilometres in the back of a lorry. Once again there were bogs on either side of the road. The lorry belonged to the OGPU farm where Yershov's father was working. It was jammed with deported workers being sent to fell trees. Yershov questioned them, but they were afraid of his uniform and answered only in monosyllables. Towards evening the lorry reached a small village squeezed in between the edge of the forest and the edge of the bog. Yershov was to remember the gentle calm of that sunset in the northern wastes. In the evening light the huts looked quite black, as though they had been boiled in pitch. When he entered the dugout, bringing with him the evening light, he was met by the smell of poverty, by miserable food, miserable clothes, and miserable bedding, by a warm, suffocating dampness that was filled with smoke. Then his father emerged from the darkness. The expression on his thin face, in his handsome eyes, was indescribable. He flung his thin arms around his young son's neck. There was such pain in his plea for help, such trust, that Yershov could find only one response. He burst into tears. Soon afterwards, they visited 3 graves. Yershov's mother had died during the first winter, his elder sister Anyuta during the second winter, and Marusya during the third. Here in this world of camps, the cemeteries and villages merged together. The same moss grew on the walls of wooden huts, on the sides of dugouts, on the grave mounds, and on the tussocks in the bogs. Yershoff's mother and sisters would remain forever beneath this sky, through dry winter frosts, through wet autumns when the soil of the cemetery swells as the dark bog encroaches. Father and son stood there in silence, side by side. Then the father glanced up at his son and spread his hands helplessly, as though to say, "May I be pardoned by both the living and the dead. I failed to save the people I loved." That night his father told his story. He spoke calmly and quietly. What he described could only be spoken about quietly. It could never be conveyed by tears or screams. On a small box covered with newspaper stood some food and a half-litre of vodka Yershoff had brought as a present. The old man talked while his son sat beside him and listened. He talked about hunger, about people from the village who had died, about old women who had gone mad, about children whose bodies had grown lighter than a chicken or a balalaika. He described their 50-day journey, in winter, in a cattle wagon with a leaking roof. Day after day the dead had travelled alongside the living. They had continued the journey on foot, the women carrying their children in their arms. Yershoff's mother had been delirious with fever. They had been taken to the middle of the forest, where there wasn't a single hut or dugout. In the depths of winter they had begun a new life, building campfires, making beds out of spruce branches, melting snow in saucepans, burying their dead. "The will of Stalin," he said, without the least trace of anger or resentment. He spoke as simple people speak about a force of destiny, a force that knows no weakness or hesitation. Yershoff returned from leave and sent a petition to Kalinin, begging him to act with supreme, unprecedented mercy to pardon an innocent old man and allow him to come and live with his son. Before this letter even reached Moscow, Yershoff was summoned before the authorities. He had been denounced for making his journey to the Urals. After being discharged from the army, he went to work on a building site. He wanted to save some money and then join his father. Very soon, however, he received a letter from the Urals informing him of his father's death. On the second day of the war, Lieutenant Yershoff was called up. During the battle for Yaroslavl, his battalion commander was killed. Yershoff took command. He rallied his men, launched a counterattack, won back the ford, and secured the withdrawal of the heavy artillery belonging to the General Staff Reserves. The greater the burden, the stronger his shoulders became. He didn't know his own strength. Submissiveness just wasn't a part of his nature. The stronger the force against him, the more furious his determination to fight. Sometimes he wondered why it was he felt such hatred for the Vlasovites. What Vlasov said in his appeals to the prisoners was exactly what he had heard from his father. He knew it was true, but he also knew that on the tongues of the Germans and Vlasovites, this truth turned into a lie. He was certain that he was not only fighting the Germans, but fighting for a free Russia, certain that a victory over Hitler would be a victory over the death camps where his father, his mother, and his sisters had perished. Now that his background was no longer relevant, Yershoff had proved himself a true leader, a force to be reckoned with. This realization was at once pleasant and bitter. High rank, decorations, the special section, personnel departments, examination boards, telephone calls from the Raycom, the opinion of the deputy chief of the political section, none of this meant anything anymore. Mostovskoy once told him, "In the words of Heinrich Heine, we're all of us naked beneath our clothes." But while one man looks miserable and anemic when he takes off his uniform, another man is disfigured by tight clothing. You only see his true strength when he's naked. His dreams had become a concrete task. He was constantly going over everything he knew about people, weighing up their good and bad points, wondering whom he should recruit, whom he should entrust with what position, who should he include in his underground staff. There were 5 names that came to mind. Petty human weaknesses and eccentricities suddenly took on a new importance. Trivial matters were no longer trivial. General Glutz had the authority of his rank, but he was weak-willed, cowardly, and obviously uneducated. He must have needed a good staff and an intelligent second-in-command. He took it for granted, never showing the least gratitude, that the other officers should do him favours and give him presents of food. He seemed to remember his cook more often than his wife and daughters. He was always talking about hunting, about ducks and geese. All he appeared to remember about the years he had served in the Caucasus was the wild goats and boar he had hunted. From the look of him, he had drunk a lot, and he boasted. He often talked about the defeats of 1941. Everyone else, including his neighbours on either side, had made countless mistakes, while he himself had always been right. But he never blamed the top brass for the disasters of that year. He'd seen a lot of service. Yes, and he knew how to get on with the right people. If it had been up to him, Yershov wouldn't have trusted Glutz with a regiment, let alone a whole corps. Brigade Commissar Osipov, on the other hand, was a very intelligent man. One moment he would crack a joke about how they had expected an easy war on the enemy's territory. An hour later he'd be giving a sermon to someone who had shown signs of faint-heartedness, ticking him off with stony severity, and the next day he'd be announcing in his lisping voice, "Yes, comrades, we fly higher than anyone else, further than anyone else, and quicker than anyone else. Just look how far we've managed to fly." He spoke very lucidly about the defeats of the first months of the war, but with no more regret than a chess player who's lost a piece. He talked freely and easily to people, but with a bluff comradeliness that seemed affected and false. What he enjoyed most was talking to Kotikov. Why was it that he was so interested in Kotikov? Osipov had vast experience. He knew people. And this was very important for Yersov's underground staff, even essential, but it might turn out to be a hindrance. Osipov liked to tell amusing anecdotes about important military figures, referring them familiarly as Semyon, Budyonny, Adyusha, Yeremenko. Once he told Yershov, "Tukhachevsky, Yegorov, and Blucher were no more guilty than you or me." Kirillov, however, had told Yershov that in 1937, when Osipov had been deputy director of the military academy, he had mercilessly denounced dozens of men as enemies of the people. He was terrified of being ill, constantly prodding himself, or sticking out his tongue and squinting at it in case it was furred over. But he clearly wasn't afraid of death. Colonel Zlato Krylets was very gloomy, but a straightforward man and a real soldier. He blamed the High Command for 1941. Everyone could sense his strength as a commanding officer. He was equally strong physically. He had a powerful voice, the kind of voice one needs to rally fugitives or lead an attack, and he swore a lot. He found it easier to give orders than explanations, but he was a true comrade, someone who'd give a soldier soup from his own mess tin. No, there were certainly no flies on Zlato Krylets. He was a man Yershov could work with, even if he was coarse and boorish. As for Kirillov, he was intelligent, but somehow very weak. He noticed every trifle. His tired, half-closed eyes saw everything. He was cold, misanthropic, but surprisingly ready to forgive weakness and cowardice. He wasn't afraid of death. Indeed, there were times when it seemed to attract him. His view of the retreat was more intelligent than that of any of the other officers. Not a party member himself, he had once said, I don't believe the communists can make people better. It just doesn't happen. Look at history. Although he appeared to feel indifferent about everything, one night he had just lain there and cried. Yershov had asked what was the matter. After a long time he had replied very quietly, "I'm sad about Russia." On another occasion he had said, "One thing I do miss is music." And yesterday he'd come up with a crazy grin on his face and said, "Listen, Yershov, I'm going to read you a poem." Yershov hadn't liked it, but the words had lodged themselves in his memory. "No need, comrade, in this unceasing pain of yours to call for help. Strange, but it's you I call to help me to warm my hands again. Yes, on your still warm blood I'll warm mine too, so do not worry, do not weep or bleed. Nothing can harm you now that you are dead. Can you help me? There's one thing I need, your boots. There are still battles ahead." Had he written that himself? No, he certainly didn't want Kirillov. How could he lead others if it was all he could do to keep himself going? But as for Mostovskoy, he was astonishingly well educated, and he had an iron will. People said he'd been like granite under interrogation. Still, there was no one Yershov couldn't find fault with. The other day he'd said to Mostovskoy, "Why do you waste so much time gossiping with riffraff, Mikhail Sidorovitch? Why bother with that gloomy Ikonikov Mort, or that one-eyed scoundrel of an émigré?" "Are you afraid I'll waver in my convictions?" asked Moskovskoy teasingly. "Do you think I'll become an evangelist or a Menshevik?" "Who knows," said Yershov. "If you don't want to smell, you shouldn't touch shit. That Ikonikov of yours was in our camps once. Now the Germans are dragging him off for interrogation. He'll sell himself. He'll sell you. He'll sell whoever's close to you." No one was ideal. Yershov simply had to weigh up everyone's strengths and weaknesses. And that was easy enough, but it was only from a man's spirit that you could judge his suitability. And this could be guessed at, but never measured. He had begun with Mostovskoy.